She was in the room when they started flogging him. They aimed at his back and neck, the most vulnerable parts of the body. The flogging grew in intensity, and Shri tried not to watch. She stared at a piece of paper in front of her, trying to concentrate on anything but the atrocity going on in her presence. When she heard him fall, she turned around to see what had happened. He was lying prostrate on the floor. Thick white foam was oozing out of his mouth. When she rushed over to him, the torturers did nothing to hold her back. A few moments later, the boy was dead. This is one of hundreds of thousands of fragments of memory carried forward from a bleak and grotesque past, a time that is remembered by silence, a forgotten genocide. In little over 6 months, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people were executed in Indonesia. Another million or so were imprisoned without charge, some for more than 30 years. The CIA, the same organization that helped make it happen, would later write that it ranked as one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century, alongside the Soviet purges of the 1930s and the Nazi killings of the Second World War. But the CIA is not like you or me. It did not see an atrocity, but a shining example. Its objective to wipe out communism in Indonesia was a success, and it desired to export the same system in their perverse game of Cold War politics. How Indonesia became the site of such an atrocity and a depraved model of anti-communist slaughter can only be understood once we grasp the many forces behind it. And to do so, we must look back to the aftermath of World War II. Europe was facing the immense task of rebuilding from devastation and deep political division, while across the Middle East, new nations emerged amidst decolonization and competing nationalist rivalries. In Asia, countries grappled with the legacies of occupation, revolution, and the difficult transition to independence. It was, in every sense, a reordering of the global system. But for the United States, rebuilding meant something more ambitious, the construction of a new international order in which it would lead. By 1950, the American economy was so dominant that it accounted for 40% of global GDP, and it was determined to assert its power. The US deployed its financial resources and military strength to rebuild nations and build the post-war world in its own image. In contrast, the Soviet Union was emerging from the war under vastly different conditions. Having lost 13% of its population and suffered trillions of dollars in damages, it faced an enormous reconstruction challenge. Yet despite this material disadvantage, the USSR projected a different kind of power. To many in the emerging Third World, Moscow represented hope. It spoke against the Western colonial systems that had exploited the Third World for centuries and offered itself as an ally, championing independence without insisting on political subordination. For countries across Asia, Africa, and beyond, this was a moment of possibility, a time in which the label Third World was embraced as a mark of pride rather than a sign of poverty. It signified the beginning of a third chapter, in which formerly colonized nations could assert their independence and reshape global affairs. And while the Cold War tends to be broken down into simple lines, for many newly independent countries, the choice wasn't so black and white. Even after emerging from Western domination and the USSR projecting itself as a sympathetic figure, many in the Third World desperately wanted to maintain a relationship with both the Soviet Union and the United States. For a brief moment, this balance actually seemed achievable, with relations with the two superpowers being tolerated on the global stage. However, the Red Scare was also real and intensifying, and this idea of non-alignment would be viewed with growing suspicion. The world watched closely as the Soviet Union consolidated its influence over Central and Eastern Europe, and many in the West believed that a takeover of Western Europe was imminent. Communism came to be viewed not as a diverse set of movements, but as a single, coordinated global conspiracy directed from Moscow. Even small communist groups were suspected of plotting to overthrow governments, and it was widely assumed that wherever they operated, they did so under Soviet command. This anxiety expressed itself in the Truman Doctrine. In justifying support for the anti-communists in Greece, President Truman warned that the country was threatened by, quote, terrorist activities led by communists, and argued that it must be U.S. policy to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation. In reality, this portrayal was a grossly simplified and distorted view of the complex dynamics of the Greek conflict, portraying the fight simply as good versus evil, free versus subjugated. Nevertheless, as the Cold War grew on, this binary view came to define U.S. foreign policy. Nations either supported the United States and its communist crusade, or they didn't. In the Philippines, American-supported forces crushed the Communist Hook Rebellion, leaving behind an authoritarian regime aligned with Washington. In Iran, democratically elected Mossadegh, who was not communist but anti-foreign control, was overthrown after nationalizing oil and replaced with a brutal monarchy. In Guatemala, democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz, also not a communist, was removed after implementing land reforms that threatened foreign corporate interests, and a US-backed strongman took his place. It was in this atmosphere that attention turned with increasing anxiety to the sprawling archipelago of Indonesia. Indonesia first gained independence from the Dutch in 1945 and was a nation built on extraordinary complexity. Stretching across more than 13,000 islands, home to hundreds of distinct ethnic groups and languages, it was one of the most diverse places on Earth. Holding it together required both vision and will. Leading the country's independence movement, Sukarno became Indonesia's first president. He was charismatic, passionate, and unwavering in his belief that his country should chart its own destiny. At the center of his political philosophy was a concept he called Pancasila, or 5 intersecting principles. They were belief in God, justice and civilization, unity, democracy, and social justice. It was an attempt to forge a coherent national identity out of immense diversity, placing inclusion and balance above ideological rigidity. And like many leaders of newly independent nations, Sukarno sought cordial ties with both the United States and the Soviet Union. He had no interest in becoming a client state of either. His focus was on Indonesia and its independence, autonomy, and future. Guided by the same principles, in 1955, he hosted the Bandung Conference in West Java, heralding, in his own words, the first intercontinental conference of color peoples in the history of mankind. It gathered representatives from 29 African and Asian nations, countries representing over half the world's population, marking the beginning of what would become the non-aligned movement. In his opening address, Sukarno spoke with unmistakable clarity. For many generations, our peoples have been the voiceless ones in the world. We have been the unregarded, the peoples for whom decisions were made by others whose interests were paramount, the peoples who lived in poverty and humiliation. Then our nations demanded, nay fought, for independence, and achieved independence, and with that independence came responsibility. We have heavy responsibilities to ourselves and to the world and to the yet unborn generations. It was, for Sukarno and for much of the colonized world, a coming out party. The formerly subjugated nations announced themselves as a unified political force, one that sought to usher in a new international order. Not a world of passive, exploited participants, but one in which all nations could act as agents of their own destiny. The effects were immediate. New networks of political, economic, and cultural cooperation began to take shape. Communication channels expanded. Messages were broadcast across continents, carrying what became known as the Spirit of Bandung to societies still struggling under colonial rule. And as Indonesia emerged as a hub for post-colonial opposition and a model for the non-aligned movement, it is easy to see why it would draw the ire of the United States. Indonesia, like much of the Third World, was charting a political path uniquely its own. Logically, this often meant rejecting the West's insistence on capitalism and remaining open to ideas from communism. Under leaders like Sukarno, many nations were neither communist nor staunchly anti-communist. In this vein, Indonesia was home to the PKI, the largest non-governing communist party in the world, with 3.5 million members and perhaps 20 million supporters. The PKI ran newspapers, trade unions, women's and youth groups, and competed in elections. It became the most efficient professional organization in the country. In 1955, the PKI won over 17% of the vote in Indonesia's first national election, a remarkable showing in a multi-party field. However, it's important to note that the PKI communists were a relatively peaceful group. They rejected armed struggle, frequently ignored Moscow's directions, stuck close to Sukarno, and embraced electoral politics. Its stated goal, both publicly and privately, was to form an anti-feudal, united national front with the local bourgeoisie, and not to worry about implementing socialism until the end of the century. It was doing something genuinely different from the Soviet or Chinese communist parties. They also happily fit into Sukarno's system of Nasakam, which balanced the three pillars of Indonesia, nationalism, Islam, and communism, into a tripartite system. The PKI backed Sukarno's government, and Sukarno in turn tolerated and incorporated some of their goals. However, this balanced approach to communism mattered little to Washington. US officials watched developments in Indonesia with deepening skepticism and concern. Sukarno's anti-imperialist rhetoric, his openness to working with the PKI, and his growing ties with both China and the Soviet bloc set off alarm bells. Internal US government communications from the mid-1960s underscored just how seriously this shift was taken. Memos described Indonesia as, quote, more strategically important than Vietnam, reflecting the sense that it was a critical battleground in the global struggle for influence. By early 1965, the CIA warned President Lyndon B. Johnson that Indonesia is well embarked on a course that will make it a communist nation in the reasonably near future, unless the trend is reversed. Dubious as these claims may have been, they fueled a growing sense of urgency in Washington that translated into increasingly aggressive efforts to undermine and eventually overthrow Sukarno and the PKI. Before examining the genocide itself, it is essential to understand the conditions that enabled it, which arose from both deeply rooted historical dynamics as well as deliberate social and political engineering. The first major ingredient was the division caused by Dutch colonial rule, which excelled at ruling through fracture. Over the course of 350 years, ethnic and religious groups were played against each other. Class hierarchies were entrenched, and local elites were rewarded for compliance and punished for solidarity. When independence eventually came, these personal disputes did not magically go away. While Sukarno tried to hold them in balance, beneath the surface, tensions between the army, Islamic organizations, nationalists, and the communist left remained divisive. By the early 1960s, Decades of political competition had transformed these differences into mutual suspicion and hostility. In rural areas, the PKI had built its support base largely through land reform campaigns that pushed for redistribution and organized poor peasants. Landlords and traditional elites pushed back, causing villages to split between those aligned with the left and those affiliated with nationalist or Islamic parties. The next important piece of background is the army, which emerged as one of the central institutional forces of anti-communism in Indonesia. The roots of this staunch position can be traced to the Madiun Affair of 1948, when an armed group supported by the PKI attempted to establish an autonomous political command in East Java. Alarmed by what they perceived as a direct threat to the authority of the nascent republic, the army and national leadership moved swiftly to suppress the uprising, detaining and executing its leaders. In the years that followed, the events at Madiun were consistently framed by the army and its political allies as a communist betrayal that revealed the party's subversive intent. Although the PKI subsequently reintegrated into formal politics and afterwards pursued its objectives through legal and mass-based strategies, the legacy of Madiun endured within military thinking. This latent tension became increasingly consequential by the mid-1960s, with the Indonesian army emerging as a conservative force in politics and the economy. In practice, this meant that the armed forces exercised significant influence over key institutions and played a central role in shaping national policy. The army had also adopted a doctrine of total people's defense, preparing to confront domestic enemies through the mobilization of both soldiers and civilians. Within this framework, it cultivated extensive networks of youth militias and auxiliary groups. These groups functioned as semi-official extensions of military authority and became some of the primary perpetrators of the 1965 and 66 massacres. The final component was the complex and deeply consequential role of foreign influence in enabling and shaping the military's position. For years, thousands of Indonesian army officers were brought to the United States and exposed to military doctrine and immersed in anti-communist ideology. To the confusion of American soldiers, the Indonesians were treated with extreme generosity. They were given cars, large stipends, and brought to salacious bars. As one U.S. soldier noted, it became clear to everyone that the military men were being downright wined and dined by the U.S. government. This obvious ploy was among the most important and effective. Over time, such programs contributed to a military leadership that was both viciously anti-communist and increasingly trustful of the U.S. And with this foundation for cooperation being built, Western powers provided a range of economic, military, and logistical aid to the army, both before and during the violence of 1965. Covert action from the CIA was also present before and after the massacre, going back as far as 1955 when they funneled money and strategic assistance to anti-communist parties ahead of Indonesia's elections. When that proved insufficient, the intervention escalated to actively backing armed rebellions, including supplying weapons, ammunition, and even pilots and military advisors. The scale and intensity of this intervention were revealed dramatically in May of 1958, when Indonesian forces shot down a rebel aircraft and captured its pilot, Alan Lawrence Pope, who was quickly identified as a CIA operative. While officially the US had claimed to be neutral, this incident exposed their real intentions, and rightfully so, Sukarno and his government became deeply distrustful of the United States. The last and perhaps the most consequential aspect of US tampering, psychological and political warfare, was a well-executed and highly potent method of stirring tension in Indonesia. The most absurd and shocking example is the CIA producing and distributing a pornographic film featuring a Sukarno lookalike, hoping to undermine his personal credibility and moral authority. The operation ultimately failed to achieve its intended effect, but I think this episode underscores just how far the CIA was willing to go. More effective, albeit more mundane, methods of propaganda included the US, UK, and military sponsoring news outlets, leaflets, and radio broadcasts to smear the Indonesian communists. These efforts planted fabricated or misleading stories to paint the PKI as an aggressive and expansionist force aligned with Chinese communism and intent on subverting Southeast Asia. The importance of this propaganda campaign cannot be overstated. The UK's IRD would call this and later propaganda one of the most successful propaganda operations in post-war British history. The sustained portrayal of communists as an existential threat, combined with further campaigns we will examine later, helped to cultivate the climate of fear and hostility that ultimately erupted. And now, the stage is set. With the culmination of all of these factors, Indonesia was a tinderbox. The army was strengthened, ideological lines were defined, and both domestic and foreign actors had laid the groundwork for confrontation. The army just needed an excuse, and it would come in the early hours of October 1st. A group identifying itself as the September 30th Movement abducted and killed 6 senior Indonesian army generals. The group claimed that it was acting to prevent a planned coup by a so-called Council of Generals, alleging that elements within the military were prepared to overthrow Sukarno. The operation itself was disorganized, and its leadership and true intentions remain unclear to this day. Historians continue to debate whether it was a limited internal military action, a misguided attempt to protect Sukarno, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, nothing can justify what followed. Under the veil of uncertainty, the Indonesian army, under the leadership of Major General Suharto, moved quickly to reshape reality. The event was recast as a calculated, savage coup by the PKI. It didn't matter that there was no proof to link the party to the operation. What mattered was repetition. Soon, the narrative swelled with more and more grotesque inventions. The generals weren't just killed, they were desecrated. Women of the PKI group, the Geoffrey, were said to be there, who tortured the generals, sexually mutilating them and engaging in sadistic rituals. Again, it didn't matter what was real, what was fake. It felt real. The army restricted the flow of information by seizing control of radio stations, censoring the press, and shutting down opposing outlets. All that remained was their singular narrative. And after years of sustained military and foreign propaganda, which fostered a discourse of demonization, large swaths of the population were primed to accept these stories as true. As one observer later reflected, the accusations were accepted not because they were proven, but because they felt true. With the initiative on their side, the army moved rapidly to consolidate its authority. It secured key installations in Jakarta and sidelined rival commanders, allowing Suharto to assume effective control of all of the country's operations while Sukarno's position steadily weakened. Arrests began first, thousands of people disappearing under the cover of night from their homes. In most cases, there were no warrants or no formal charges, but in this frenzied environment, nobody cared. Detainees were stuffed into overcrowded facilities and sorted. Some were released, many were not. In numerous testimonies, survivors described being lined up, waiting, listening, as those ahead of them were led away, You could hear it, one account notes, the sounds in the distance, and then silence. Victims were taken to riverbanks, fields, or forest clearings. No formal trial or executions, the process became normal. Rivers carried bodies downstream, and in some areas, witnesses later described waterways clogged with corpses. One account recalls how, quote, the river changed color, and the smell stayed for days. Another forced to take part remembered, they pushed them so that they jumped into the hole alive. Then in the hole the soldiers shot at them. Then we as the villagers buried them. Whether it was the thrill of killing or the pressure of the moment or to save themselves, civilians were drawn into the violence. The army's networks joined too. Civilian militias, religious organizations, and youth groups were mobilized, armed with machetes, knives, bamboo spears, and guns. With the army behind them, guiding them, these groups carried out much of the violence that occurred. Soon, it was an obligation to participate. If you yourself didn't take part in the violence, you ran the risk of being labeled a sympathizer. Quote, if you didn't join them, you risked joining the dead. For 6 months, this was Indonesia's reality. It spread throughout most parts of the nation and seeped into the fabric of everyday life. There was no hiding from it, no neutral ground. It reshaped how people saw their neighbors and how they saw themselves. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, it slowed. In the end, 500,000 to 1 million people were killed, and a nation that had turned against itself was left to confront what remained. We crushed their necks with wood, we hung them, we strangled them with wire, we cut off their heads, we ran them over with cars. We were allowed to do it, and the proof is, we murdered people and were never punished. This testimony was given from a former death squad member. I include it here not for shock value, as the gory nature of this event is clear, but what this quote captures is the mindset that took hold in Indonesia in the aftermath of the genocide. For society to function after such an event, people had to accept a version of reality that made it possible to move forward. Accountability was never truly entertained. To confront the horrors of this period would have meant confronting the regime's cruelty and ruthlessness. But with the army in a stronger position than ever, it pursued the only course that would secure its hold on power. Official narratives reinforced the military's portrayal of events as a heroic suppression of a coup attempt, while the people of Indonesia were consigned to silence and a state of enforced ignorance. This version of reality was backed by an indefinite punishment of those labeled as possible communists. Whether you were justly or unjustly a former prisoner, lucky enough to survive the killings, your ID card was permanently marked. This mark condemned you to a kind of permanent purgatory. You were surveilled, barred from employment, and denied basic rights. The stigma extended to your relatives and children, who were likewise monitored and barred from job opportunities. Just to live and avoid harassment, many felt forced to move away from their hometowns, change their identities, and start over in new areas. And while this environment settled over Indonesia, something very different was happening abroad. In private, and sometimes even in public, the outcome was celebrated. The New York Times ran headlines such as, "A gleam of light in Asia." To the United States and its allies, the deaths were simply a means to an end, and the ending was a success. The elimination of one of the world's largest communist parties, carried out so rapidly and with no international consequence, was a triumph. But this should come as no surprise to us, as we have seen how the environment of this event was deliberately created. What is more are the actions the US and its allies took to foment and support the killings after the events of October 1st. In their first move, US officials moved quickly to make their position clear. As one State Department memo put it, "We are, as always, sympathetic to the Army's desire to eliminate communist influence." On October 5th, the US Embassy in Jakarta received instructions to signal to the military the United States' desire to be of assistance where we can. 9 days later, US Defense Attaché William Ethel delivered that message in person to the Minister of Defense's aide. He reported that it was, quote, "just what we needed by way of assurances that we weren't going to be hit from all angles as we moved to straighten things out." On that same day, the US Embassy covertly handed over portable radios to the Army's headquarters, ensuring the generals had secure communications as the crackdown accelerated. And by mid-1966, the Johnson administration had committed to providing Suharto's regime with 350,000 tons of wheat, 200,000 tons of rice, and 160,000 bales of cotton that helped stabilize the countryside and secured civilian compliance. Foreign-produced propaganda also intensified during this period. Pamphlets and articles that purported to be written by Indonesian patriots but were in fact authored in London called for the elimination of the PKI and were laced with anti-Chinese slurs designed to inflame existing tensions. CIA-backed outlets were among the first to blame the PKI for the events of October 1st, and fabricated stories of communist atrocities circulated widely in the weeks that followed. Radio Australia, nominally a civilian broadcaster, aired programs glorifying the massacre of the PKI and broadcasted army propaganda directly into Indonesian homes. And most damningly of all, US Embassy officials compiled lists of thousands of alleged PKI members and handed them directly to Indonesian army intelligence. Those lists were used in the almost indiscriminate campaign of arrests and killings that followed. The combined effect of all of this, the assurances, the supplies, the intelligence, the propaganda, was to ensure that the Indonesian army knew, with confidence, that it would not be stopped. While this is a video about Indonesia, the story is really about something much bigger. My fixation on foreign powers is not to overshadow or underplay the brutality of the Indonesian military or other actors. If this was an isolated incident, there would need a far deeper examination of their actions. But when viewed in a broader context, it becomes difficult to ignore the US and not view it as the biggest culprit. For it did not see Indonesia as a mistake or something to quietly move on from. It saw a model, a blueprint, applied to other regions perceived to be slipping toward communism. Across Latin America, Southeast Asia, and beyond, an eerily similar pattern of violence emerged. Identify a political movement as an existential threat, fund and mobilize army and civilian forces against it, and help carry out repression with the expectation of international tolerance or support. Estimating the total number of deaths associated with this broader pattern is necessarily imprecise. However, a conservative sum of historical data suggests that in addition to the campaign in Indonesia, 1 to 2 million peoples were killed in anti-communist repression. Some of these cases I may cover in the future, as each carries its own distinct context and consequences. But within the larger arc of the Cold War, for the United States, Indonesia stands as one of the earliest examples in a wider experiment. An experiment about how the US could manipulate countries to strengthen itself.